Recording. Hello, my name is Rick Pilotte, and I've written a couple of books. And during my research, I came across some stuff that became important to realize later. I wasn't originally a climate researcher, or at least I wasn't until I realized some very important things about climate that were not being told or even hidden. Trying to determine the age of the Earth was what gave me a key piece of information about climate long before climate controversy hit the fan. Don't worry, you don't have to look at me all the time. Tree rings, or dendrochronology, is the single most accurate dating method man has. Overlapping tree rings will create a complete string of time back to a specific year. But what year? Some of the older sources I was using for research stated that tree rings or dendrochronology was good for nearly 5,400 years. So I wanted to know when tree rings were good for exactly 5,400 years. So while trying to figure this out, I was keyed into any information that had anything to do with tree ring dating. Because I wanted to know back when year one was to enable me to nail the exact date of the flood, which is what I was looking for. As you may guess, I started this long before the internet came on, because I could have normally just... So, you may have heard of dendrochronological dating, which suggests tree rings can date back as far as 8,000 years, but these dates are unreliable and confidently contested and have been for some time. Some tree rings give false readings, giving the impression that one ring is 1 year, when more than one winter can occur during a single year, and under unusual circumstances, more than 1 year. Some rings will take more than 1 year to form. My books give you a clue as to how that can happen. What I find disturbing is that some scientists want dates using wood, but they don't use the proper method of matching up the tree rings inherent in the wood sample with other tree ring dating to pinpoint the year the wood sample came from, but instead will use carbon dating on the sample, which arrive at dates often much older than any you could use for tree ring dating. So a piece of wood may suggest that it was 12,000 years old, but of course tree ring dating only goes back 5,400 years, so that date is clearly wrong. Tree rings also tell us weather and wind patterns during that particular year. Hurricane seasons, which have certain isotopes, are absorbed into the wood, and they can tell you if it's a strong season or a weak season for hurricanes. Length and strength of seasons, hot or cold summers, long or short winters, insect infestations, drought periods, climate over extended periods, solar activity, sunny days or lack of them, volcanic activity is seen in tree rings, and other important historical data. And of course, these events seen in the tree rings will pinpoint these events to an exact year, which is why tree rings are so good. The first clue that something was wrong with the global warming we were being warned about came when I first saw the hockey stick graph, as this hockey stick graph. While working on my first book, I saw Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. At first his spiel seemed to line up with what the ecological doomsayers from the 70s were saying, and various ancient legends, and even the Bible were telling about man despoiling the earth. However, when I saw the hockey stick graph, I knew instantly it was an incorrect graph. It may sound odd or unbelievable that I knew right away the graph was wrong, but I've always had this love of graphs and graph paper and made some graphs just for the fun. And I often think in terms of graphs. I mean, for example, in grade 3, we were told to draw to the music. And I had no idea what she meant. She was looking for the mood of the music. I was drawing the music in graph forms, low notes at the bottom and high notes at the top. I loved doing graphs in my physics class, but would graph things even in my own time just for fun and curiosity. I've graphed the price of gold, the Canadian dollar, the dollar in relation to gold, gas prices, and now that I'm old and decrepit and have to watch my diet, I even graphed my water, calories, and sodium intake so I can see visually how I'm doing. Lots of them. I say this to show that I like and enjoy graphs, and they are second nature to me, so that when I saw the hockey stick graph, I knew instantly it was wrong and said so out loud when I saw this graph for the first time on TV. The hockey stick graph shows global temperatures slowly and steady declining for 1,000 years and then suddenly increasing from about 1900 to the highest point in history, supposedly due to increases of CO2 emissions. So how did I know the graph was wrong? From my previous research, I had come across some climate material in relation to dendrochronology, so I knew there was historical warm and cold periods that were not being shown in the hockey stick graph. Though I couldn't remember exactly where the warm and cool periods were placed in time, I knew a genuine climate graph would not even be remotely similar to what was being shown in the hockey stick graph. Soon after seeing the hockey stick graph, though, I saw Steve McIntyre refuting the graph on TV. I knew he was correct, as his explanation correlated with my personal research, so I figured this climate mess would get cleared up soon enough, without any help from me. Hockey stick graph, picture 7. Okay, later on I tracked down the information that I couldn't recall about these warm and cold periods and determined the warm and cold periods were known as the medieval warm period, the Maunder minimum, and the Dalton minimum. For fun and curiosity, I plotted them on top of the hockey stick graph, showing very roughly, but close, how they would appear on the graph. It's also important to note and realize that the medieval warm period started around 800 AD. We'll see why this is important later on. With a little hunting, I found an undated, smooth climate graph that shows a medieval warm period, but the original presenter of the graph may come as a shock. This is the IPCC's own graph from a few years prior to the hockey stick graph, which is considerably different from the hockey stick version. Why the changed graph? What's going on? Why? Was it error? No, something far more problematic. It is deliberate deception. Something dubbed ClimateGate gave us a window into the infamy and deception behind the hockey stick graph, discovered through leaked emails between scientists and the IPCC, creating the data for promoting the global warming hypothesis, now called settled science. These scientists, or the influences behind them, have some sort of ulterior motive because they have deliberately compromised the data to eliminate the medieval warm period and apparently the Maunder and Dalton minimums from the graph as well. Some will point to points on the hockey stick graph and call them indications of these historic warm and cool periods, but the graph isn't anywhere close to reflecting the true length and strength of these warm and minimal periods. Many emails were uncovered that showed them agonizing over the difficulty of manipulating the data with computer programs to create the impression of steady or even slowly decreasing temperatures, followed by rapidly increasing temperatures used to produce the hockey stick graph. I know how tough struggling against computer programs can be, so I can see they're trying to make the... Okay, anyway, the internet is now trying to undo the ClimateGate PR damage, but other sources confirm the conspiracy. David Deming, for example. Thinking geophysicist Dr. David Deming was a promoter of the global warming theory. One of his colleagues let down his guard. What the colleague said to Deming was presented to the U.S. Senate from an email he got from this unnamed prominent climate change researcher, which said in part, "We have to get rid of the medieval warm period." Furthermore, leaked memos from climate research units showed they were aware the medieval warm period was absent on the graph but kept this knowledge hidden. One of the scientists exposed by ClimateGate finally admitted that the Earth may have been warmer during the medieval warm period than now. That's right, he said it was even warmer during the medieval warm climate than it is now. The medieval warm period extended from 800 to 1300 AD. That's 500 straight years of known Earth climate that was warmer than Earth is now, with no perceptible addition of man-made CO2 from emissions. Why would they struggle so hard to eliminate the medieval warm period from the graph? If you want to promote settled science that shows the Earth is warmer now than at any time in history and blame the heating on mankind somehow, they had to eliminate the medieval warm period so they could lie to us to create an artificial global crisis that needed powers to initiate the hands of a few people such as IPC and built the world of nations of trillions of dollars. All undoctored graphs show the Earth was considerably warmer during the medieval warm period than it is today. All post-1940 graphs show the planet wasn't any warmer then than it has been for centuries and millennia due to steep increases in CO2 emissions, except, of course, the hockey stick graph. The scientists that influenced the UN's IPCC said that the world would be facing catastrophic warming unless trillions of dollars are spent to avert it. The U.S. alone was earmarked for over $5 trillion to avert this supposed catastrophe of global warming. So these dire warnings are based mainly on flawed computer models and the hockey stick graph, which has now been positively proven to be faked. Yet internet sources are constantly trying to undo PR damage, deniers due to their models, and thus climate gurus become deniers themselves. They minimize the medieval warm period, ignore the solar contribution to the climate in cold and warm periods of history, and ignore those nasty heat-retaining moisture droplet clusters we call clouds. Paleoclimate records showed large regions of the planet were considerably warmer than they are today, and were so for several thousand years, and now, contrary to popular belief, many parts of the globe are now experiencing the coldest temperatures in thousands of years. Why? What is this Maunder minimum, and what caused it? The sun has two magnetic fields. Professor Valentina Zarkova discovered that the sun has two magnetic fields, not one, and the interaction or lack thereof between these two fields either amplifies or dampens solar activity. And for the first time in many decades, these two fields have separated from each other for what will be the next 3 solar cycles. These solar cycles are 11 years long, meaning almost no magnetic field disruption on the sun, and thus minimal sunspot counts from 2019 or 2020 until 2053. This current solar phenomena will create what will very likely be another Maunder minimum, such as the Earth experienced between 1645 and 1715, or at the very least, like the Dalton minimum from 1780 to 1830, which coincidentally ended at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which started in 1833. The sun normally has a few sunspots here and there on an ongoing basis. Whenever we look at the sun through our telescopes, we always see sunspots. I've done this myself. But now the sun is in a dormant state. Sunspots are virtually non-existent because with no interaction between the two magnetic fields stirring up the sun, solar activity has dropped to a rare low. Contemplatively, climate scientists are trying to discredit and suppress Professor Zarkova's findings. They contacted the Royal Astronomical Society behind her own team's back and demanded that they withdraw her press release. Though she offered to work with the climate scientists and add their data to her results, the offer was refused. Despite the thugs of IPCC trying to discredit Zarkova, her findings have been independently confirmed entirely. The CEO of Weather Oscillation, David Dilley's own independent research determined solar cycles last 230 years, the last ending in 1790, and the next one is due in 2020, and will last 33 years, 3 solar cycles, until 2053. These are the exact same dates Zarkova nailed down. The graph associated with him plots cooling and warming periods from the medieval period to the future. They plot nothing like the hockey stick graph, and it appears, based on a cursory look at his graph, that the coming cool periods may not be as cold as the Maunder and Dalton minimums, as I originally thought, but the coming cold periods, if not planned for, could still cause havoc on Earth. Other scientists have now confirmed these findings, meaning the global cold spell, lasting from as long as 60 to 100 years, is right now in the offing. So what would a Maunder minimum mean for us? Solar sunspot occurrences are at the lowest ebb in nearly 400 years. During the Maunder minimum, winter snowfalls were much heavier than previously or afterwards. Freezes were longer, and the snow came more often and stayed for months longer. Furthermore, springs and summers were colder and wetter. Glaciers grew, and crop growing in Europe had to adapt to a shortened and somewhat unreliable growing season. The end of the Dalton minimum, 1789 to 1830, marked the end of the ice fair. popular from the time of Queen Elizabeth I to the mid-1830s. The Thames River froze so regularly that ice fairs were held on it within sight of the London Bridge, often during the winters from 1680s to the last one in 1814. During the monominimum, sunspots were exceedingly rare. During a 30-year span, just 50 solitary sunspots were seen, when the normal number for a 30-year span would be between 40 and 50,000. This caused global temperatures to drop fairly dramatically around the globe for this long stretch from 1645 to 1715. During this time, the Thames River froze regularly every year, so you could walk on ice from Manhattan Island to Staten Island. People could walk from Denmark across to Sweden. Norway glaciers grew as much as 100 meters a year, destroying farms and villages. Snow remained at lower temperatures year-round, and farmlands had snow on them till late spring. How would this affect us now? Food production, believe it or not, has fallen behind consumption for over a dozen years. There's a reason for this. If we are in for another Maunder minimum, and weather patterns locally and abroad indicate we are in the start of a cooling down period, then global food production will fall off dramatically for the next 40 or so years if we don't start addressing this problem right now with extended indoor growing practices and using improving advanced growing technologies like beefed up CO2 growing environments and hyperbaric growing conditions. But if we believe the climate agenda, we could in fact doom the planet to global famine. Something that has been prophesied as something that will happen in the last days. Could this lie about global warming during a time of global cooling be the cause? Fighting climate change is the main reason food production has dropped for over a dozen years. How so? Over 30% of the corn crops in USA and other countries are now being used to create ethanol to mix in gasoline, meaning food production is being sacrificed to create fuel, reducing world crops below the sustainability level. If this isn't reversed soon, famines will be ongoing. Worse, BC and USA are considering upping the ethanol content of gas from 10 to 30%. This will reduce fuel efficiency and raise food prices even more and drive up car repair bills. Even the corn costs have nearly doubled since they've been used in fuel. Higher car repair bills? Why? Some of the following materials I've gleaned from the research by C. Ford Runge. Ethanol damages car engines with accelerated engine wear and failure, as well as fuel system damage and reduced efficiency. Ethanol can cause engine stalling if the water in the ethanol separates from the gasoline and floods the engine. Gummed up fuel systems, damaged tanks, and stray moisture infiltrating the system have all increased since E10, ethanol 10%, was introduced into gasoline. My own car had to have a new gas tank installed because the old one was rusted out. A cost of $800, and my car was only the year 2000. Furthermore, corn ethanol actually reduces the engine performance. Drops by 3 or 4% in your gas mileage, and it drops even more on higher ethanol percentages. E85 used in some vehicles have increased ozone-related fatalities, asthma, and hospitalizations from ethanol particulates by 9%, as seen in Los Angeles. If that's not bad enough, non-corn-based cellulose ethanol falls far short of expectations, and thus increased the need for more corn used in ethanol, further draining the global food supply. Bee populations have declined more obviously in the Midwest Corn Belt and California's Central Valley areas due to the use of non-flowering species of corn essential for bees to survive on. Going from E15 to E30 would make things just worse, with problems such as more carbon emissions, more toxic water pollutants, toxic algae blooms, higher water costs, and even higher fuel costs, and more troubling further reduction of bee population. And of course, less food to go around. 9 energy sources were ranked in relation to environmental, and they found that ethanols were ranked last of the 9 technologies with respect to climate, air pollution, land use, wildlife damage, and chemical waste. That's right, we are damaging the environment more with the use of ethanol now. Smog was an ongoing problem in Los Angeles until they realized it was caused by cars, and so anti-pollution statutes altered fuels and cars to reduce pollution to a minimum. Looking for a new fight, CO2 seems to have won by default, as if it had some direct, dire consequences. But only in concentrations such as were occurring on Apollo 13 could it ever be a problem. Listen to broadcasters and even politicians. See how often they call CO2 pollution. It's not pollution. It's a natural occurring gas that living creatures exhale and the oceans release to feed plants so that we can eat. Even the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, has called it pollution, indicating he has no idea what CO2 is. So do sunspots really matter to us down here on Earth? Is there really some connection with climate and sunspots? Can we prove it? Climate gurus seem certain that we are in for global heating based on maybe 50 years of technical data using slanted interpretations, worst case scenario computer models, and using illogical assumptions, with non-scientists like Al Gore's words spreading the cheer. Yet, they have contested the effect of sunspots on weather here on Earth, because average seasonal records apparently don't go back far enough to make a direct statistical link between Earth temperatures and sunspots. They're good with their measly 50 years of data, but they're not good with ours. Well, actually, records of a more unconventional kind do exist. For example, scientists have recently accessed Rhine River boatmen records that go back for centuries and can be correlated with weather patterns with sunspot activity back to the time when telescopes were reinvented in 1609, well before the Maunder minimum set in. The river records describe important things like when the river was frozen over. This data has confirmed to a 99% degree of certainty that the relationship between solar cycles and temperature on the Rhine are inherently linked, which of course is true for the rest of the planet. However, some have said, well, the Little Ice Age had nothing to do with suns, and suggest the Maunder minimum was only a European or Northern Hemisphere issue. Well, that has also been shot full of holes by a team of United Kingdom researchers which studied a peat bog near the southern tip of South America. These bogs indicated synchronization of the Little Ice Age in the southern hemisphere with that of the north, further confirming that the sun determines climate. Oh, what are the odds of that? Still determined, climate gurus refuse to accept solar causes of the Maunder and Dalton minimums and instead blame volcanic activity for driving temperatures down severely on the whole globe. Now, it's true that volcanism plays a huge role in dropping global temperatures, and their activity during these times clearly had a big role to play in global temperatures. Indeed, Dilly's graph included major volcanic eruptions as tied with global temperatures. Volcanic eruptions evaporate tons of moisture and spread particulates around the globe, reducing sunlight, causing temperatures to drop and increasing snowfalls as a result. After 1830, global volcanic action slowed down, and subsequently the Earth's mean average temperature slowly rose. It is simply coincidence that global active volcanism decreased about the same time the Industrial Revolution began. Thus, climate guys are taking the blame away from the sun and the variations of global volcanism and placing it on the very slight buildup of trace natural CO2 gas of the Industrial Revolution and beyond. Without any accompanying volcanism, the current solar minimum might not reduce the temperatures the same as it did during the Maunder minimum. But this does not mean we should ignore it. Even some of the ancients had the knowledge that the sun had 11 and 33-year cycles and planted double crops in those years to compensate for reduced crop yields during the expected colder periods. They're not as stupid as many of the evolution-based anthropologists want us to believe. Some weather station data is contaminated with readings done in close proximity to urban centers. By way of comparison, astronomers like to have their observatories as far away from the urban centers as possible, and ideal viewing conditions are in ice-cold winter weather, as the air tends to be very still. I have looked through telescopes myself, and they are much clearer during the winter. I looked at Jupiter, and it's crystal clear when it's freezing out. Cities contaminated cities contaminate the sky with ambient city light and the heat of the air, distorting, fuzzing, and quivering stellar images, further reducing clarity. Similarly, in areas where real apparent temperature increases have occurred, based on weather stations readings over the last century, it has been discovered that many of these stations have been encroached upon by urban development over the same time frame. Some of these stations might be a little hotter than others. Thus, what appears to be genuine temperature increases were found to come from weather stations that had their temperature records affected by local factors, such as land development. It's well known that temperatures above and near cities are far warmer than out in the country in the same region because cities radiate heat. There is overwhelming evidence that the IPCC's climate data is contaminated with these surface effects due to industrialization and urban development. Thus, what could be extrapolated from contaminated data like this is frightful temperature increases when looked at on the backdrop of what would be considered normal. Much of this data is still being used in climate models despite the obvious flaws of using such data. Compromised weather data could give the apparent indication of alarming temperature increases. Since this is known to climate scientists, it begs the question, why don't they correct the problem? There appears to be deliberate deception going on, with Gore a party to it. In his movie An Inconvenient Truth, Gore used a graph which appears to show a close link between CO2 and temperature. But more important to the point, Gore eliminated a key component from the graph to come to a predetermined conclusion that CO2 drives temperature. Here's how it was done. He got the Antarctic ice core graph from the June 1999 Journal of Nature. The original graph had 3 components, not 2: temperature, CO2, and insolation. But Gore's graph took the insolation part out of the equation, and it was not for the purpose of simplification. So what is insolation? Insolation is the amount of input from the sun on a particular spot. Neither CO2 nor temperature can change the insolation, as insolation is all light and heat intensity from the sun. The technical explanation is hard to read through and grasp in one go, but here it is. The insolation is primarily governed by the eccentricity, the longitude of the perihelion, and the precessional parameter and the obliquity. I told you it was hard to read. Basically, insolation is just the amount of sun and heat and light from the sun, which is determined by the spherical part on the Earth in which it falls. It is the sun that creates the heat, and the heat releases the CO2 from the ocean into the atmosphere, and this increases the apparent. This becomes apparent in the precipitation stored in the ice cores from which this data was taken. You will notice that Gore switched the graph from left to right. Though this retains the integrity of the information encapsulated in the graph, what this very slide does is make the cause appear to be the effect. What appears to be Gore's purpose in switching the graph from left to right is to give the impression that CO2 drives temperature, which of course is his narrative, when in fact it is the other way around. It is the temperature which determines the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Here's how Hubertus Fisher of Scripps Institute of Oceanography stated it in 1999 when he wrote in the Journal of Science, "High-resolution records from Antarctic ice cores show that carbon dioxide concentrations increased 600 plus or minus 400 years after warming." Actually, no graph could so closely link the two with such an obvious correlation over such a time span, and the entire time date line has to be compressed to only a few thousand years for it to be plausible, as a visible link can be clearly demonstrated between CO2 and temperature in the same year on a graph. Nevertheless, what he is saying is CO2 increases are directly caused from increased temperature. That's right. It is temperature that drives CO2 saturation content, and not the other way like we are being told by the media and these climate gurus. In another part of Gore's film, he rephrases the same thing when he notes a teacher discovered a direct year-by-year correlation between temperature, seasons, and rising CO2. But the way he explains it makes it sound like CO2 is driving the temperature to rise. What is actually happening is seasonal heating is releasing CO2 from the ocean so that CO2 climbs and drops in response to temperature, not the other way around. Okay, this next point is vital to grasp because we are being asked to spend trillions of dollars to correct this problem. But this next fact will clearly indicate it is a fictional problem. Now, it's true that the global CO2 concentration has increased from 1958 to date from 315 parts per million to 405 parts per million. So that's being ramped up like some big deal. But in the big picture, we'll see this is really a small amount. But more importantly, just 3.4% of that increase can be directly attributed to man. Or that would be 2.89 parts per million. What this means is if the entire globe stopped every last CO2 emission from 1958 to the date, the CO2 concentration would have increased from 315 parts per million to 402. It still would have gone up. And almost as much. We've done nothing to it. And it's important to realize satellite pictures showing reduced pollution during COVID. Oh, this is important. During the COVID-19, which is still going on, satellite images show a lot of reduced pollution over like China. And yet they don't show any reduced pollution over the oceans where all the CO2 is coming from because it's not visible on the cameras. And yet we're being led to believe that the CO2 is part of that pollution. CO2 is not pollution. However, satellite pictures have revealed what CO2 is doing to the Earth. More CO2 is better, not less. More than 500 climate scientists have been studied by investigators, and they found these scientists concluded that the existence of man-made global warming was very doubtful. They also concluded temperature increases are beneficial as sudden cooling periods have killed twice as many people as warm spells. That's assuming CO2 was raising the temperature in the first place. Paradoxically, reducing CO2 emissions may be the exact opposite of what we need to do, as this would reduce crop output dramatically, causing widespread famine. The fact is that elevated CO2 increases plant productivity, and here is proof. U.S. Geophysical Research Letters Journal, in conjunction with Australian National University, determined via satellite observations from 1982 to 2010 that increased CO2 levels correlated with an 11% increase in foliage cover across parts of arid areas studied, which included Australia, North America, Middle East, and Africa. That's right, 11% increase in foliage from the extra CO2. Altered leaf coverage can be detected by satellite, especially in desert and savanna areas where, generally speaking, foliage is less dense than in more humid locations. Research scientist Dr. Randall Donohue of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization stated that Australian vegetation seems quite sensitive to CO2 fertilization. While a CO2 effect on foliage response has long been speculated, until now it has been difficult to demonstrate. The conclusion deemed that increased CO2 levels will boost the foliage in dry countries and boost forestry and agriculture in these areas as well. The same increase in foliage, of course, would be occurring in more moist areas as well, boosting up crop yields. The benefit of surplus CO2 is no secret in Holland. The Dutch have been using superior amounts of CO2 to grow fantastic tulips for over 50 years. They've been beefing up the CO2 for over 50 years to make better crops. Neil Frank, former director of National Hurricane Center, says cutting carbon emissions would wind up hurting poor people. Asked if he thinks more CO2 in the air would be a good thing, he said, exactly. Maybe we're living in a carbon dioxide starved world. We don't know. As it turns out, ancient climate evidence confirms this actually is the case. Trying to deliberately reduce CO2 is literally like trying to reduce population through starvation from reduced crop production. Thankfully, since such a small part of the net gain in CO2 concentration is due to man in the first place, even if we stopped contribution completely, the negative effects would be negligible. So is 400 parts per million a problem? Ancient climate is known to have CO2 levels as high as 4,000 to 7,000 parts per million, with the average CO2 concentration over history of 1,200 parts per million. That's at least triple what our concentration is right now. It's well known that during the era of the dinosaurs, Earth's vegetation was far more abundant and lush, and it's no coincidence that these high CO2 concentrations existed during these eras. CO2 concentration during this period was far higher. What this means is the dinosaurs probably had lots of tulips to munch on. Well, at least the ones that lived in Holland. CO2 concentrations have been on average decreasing from a high of 7,000 parts per million, an estimated 550 million years ago, to the current level, assuming you believe in the traditional dating parameters. Actually, CO2 concentrations like these could be shown to have existed during historical times. Not too long ago, for most climate scaremongers, everything was blamed on global warming. You may remember the rhetoric. It began to look ridiculous as they blamed anything and everything, from heat to rain and even huge snow fluctuations. It wasn't long before political cartoonists were having fun with this. People running a climate agenda had to stop the ridicule somehow, so they changed the terminology from global warming to climate change. The very fact that it's now called climate change and not global warming is an ongoing testimony to the fact that global warming was obviously an incorrect analysis of the data and was definitely not predicted by the computer models or any global warming advocates for that matter. Now with the term changed to climate change, global warming is assumed by association, when in fact global warming has already been discredited. But if you say climate change, you can now blame anything, and I mean anything, on it. And they even make up stuff to tug at your heart-loving animal strings, such as polar bears and the Arctic. With global warming, the Arctic ice shrinkage became a nice whipping boy, and to tug at your heartstrings, polar bears were brought into the fray. Gore and others are telling us that polar bear populations are in danger and should be put on endangered species lists because of global warming is melting the Arctic ice. They assume that these poor polar bears need ice to live with, and think we believe this, and assume we believe they need it for their drinks, because they sure don't need it to eat. What becomes really ridiculous is the way they put assertions on the worst kinds on any pictures of polar bears. Any pictures can be interpreted any way you want by just putting a made-up story to the picture, and this is most often done with pictures of animals, because they can't refute the story and they can't sue the storyteller. Each one of these pictures on the net has a sad story of how disappearing ice is horribly reducing the environment that polar bears supposedly need to survive in. But these are simply nature pictures of polar bears in an environment they are often seen in. Not one shred of evidence in these and many other examples indicate that polar bears were in any kind of distress. Here's the bottom line. Studies show that warming trends actually increases the bear population, not decrease it. In 1970, a polar bear population count was done, and there were an estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 polar bears in the Arctic. Recent bear censuses have been conducted, and today the total population of polar bears in the same areas is estimated to be around 25,000. That's between 2.5 and 5 times the number of polar bears we had in 1970. So there clearly is not in any danger of imminent extinction, let alone an endangered species. Polar bears survived in interglacial periods where there was far less ice in the Arctic and when the Arctic was far warmer than it is today. How much warmer? Arctic region sediments cores showing oxygen isotopes, pollen, fossils, midges, sampled from Canada, Russia, Norway, and other places demonstrate summer temperatures ranged from between 9 and 12 Celsius. In other areas, the summer temperature was as high as 16 Celsius, compared to today's average of 6 Celsius. Evidence extracted from these areas indicate that temperatures in the Arctic were between 50 and 267 between 50 and 267% warmer than they are presently. Research shows that 150 years ago, the Arctic was at its coldest, and it was far warmer in the distant past. The medieval warm period would have been one of these time frames when this was the case, which means any warming going on in the Arctic may actually mean the area is returning to a statistical norm. The Arctic ice loss is a normal fluctuation over long periods of time. Expanding, shrinking ice fields. Expanding ice coverage eventually has to reach a limit, otherwise it would grow into the tropic zones, which is just impossible, I hope. Sooner or later, there has to be a counter-move of the ice in the opposite direction, and this warming trend could continue for as long as it took to reach the maximum extremes. We've only had satellite images of the poles for a very short period, but a recent minimum in ice coverage has global warming proponents rubbing their hands with glee. Even though scientists say it's too soon to suggest this is anything other than normal polar fluctuations, they are looking at a very tiny slice of geologic history and extrapolating huge negative consequences for the most possible gain. A gain of over your tax dollars and a gain of power by declaring a crisis or a climate emergency to justify seizing control of assets and political powers to fight this monster of their own imaginations. The Arctic, as we will soon see, was undoubtedly clear of ice during the medieval warm period, when the Vikings were growing gardens in Greenland. And yet now that it's melting again, it's a climate emergency? Really? Are we to blame? Frankly, even the dated satellite pictures I could find of the supposed loss of Arctic ice coverage weren't too convincing. One of Gore's pet scare tactics is the supposed rise in sea level causing great coastal flooding. I quote Nexus Magazine, Volume 26, Number 6, page 4 and 5. In 1914, the Australian Fort Denison recording station began meticulously recording sea levels in and around Australia, including the sea to the east of Australia. Sea level can fluctuate due to tidal effects of the moon and the rotation of the Earth, but the meticulous tidal markers set up then show that from 1914 to 2019, the average sea level dropped 6 centimeters in 105 years. Actually, humidity loss is to some degree an ongoing sign of global aging, and just atmospheric pressure fluctuations on Earth push it into space. The Earth has a vapor trail streaming behind it as we travel around the sun, as slowly over time Earth's atmosphere escapes into space. Before the flood, this didn't occur, because the Earth was surrounded by a water sphere, which of course fell on the Earth during the flood, making it possible for atmosphere to escape into space ever since. A drop in the ocean level of 6 centimeters is nothing compared to 20 feet we lost. If the Earth water level has dropped just 6 centimeters in 105 years, to what do we attribute a drop of the ocean level of 20 feet? That's right. The Earth's ocean levels have dropped by 20 feet since 1500 to sometime before 1914, probably to the end of the Dalton minimum. You heard right. The ocean levels from various natural causes have dropped 20 feet in about 400 years, possibly as little as 315 years. The dramatic drop of ocean levels over the 400-year span and the minor drop since 1914 can have a variety of causes. The most recent century drop would be probably due to just a slow loss of moisture and atmosphere into space. The medieval warm period could have had a higher ocean level due to less glaciation and snow buildup on the Earth. Glaciation would have expanded after the medieval warm period ended, especially during the lower temperatures that took place during the Maunder and Dalton minimums, exacerbated by volcanic actions. Volcanic eruptions produce colder temperatures and promote faster snow buildups 2 ways: via evaporating water which falls as snow, and because of the minimized sunlight from all volcanic particulates suspended in the atmosphere dropping global temperatures. Volcanic action also punctures the stratosphere, causing atmosphere to be pushed into space, atmosphere which of course would contain moisture from the oceans. There is a startling confirming bit of evidence that geologists ignore and do not want you to know about. It's because of an astonishing map dated 1380. These maps of Greenland are so stunning and conventional cartographers and historians ignore them and pretend they don't exist or use every slight to invalidate them. For example, one of the chief reasons they discount these maps is because they display islands that don't exist where they are drawn. We'll get back to this point in a minute. These maps are staggering for a few reasons. In the 13th century, Roger Bacon wrote, "Flying machines as these were of old, and are made even in our days." This was written in the 1200s. This statement still boggles historians. The cartography behind these maps is just staggering as well. Accurate maps in theory didn't exist until spherical trigonometry was officially recognized sometime after 1500. Yet these are unbelievably accurate for the period. The first two show Greenland free of ice with mountains clearly depicted on the maps. These mountains have been verified to exist in these locations by probes done by the French polar expedition of Paul-Émile Victor back in 1947 to 49. That's right, the mountains shown here exist exactly where they are seen on the map from 1380. They didn't have ground-penetrating radar we have today, so how could they map the mountains unless they were actually void of snow? Conventional dating of the ice on Greenland puts the bottom layer of ice at between 110,000 and 200,000 years old based on the number of annual layers of ice. But the fact is, these are not annual layers, we have been told, but are hot and cold layers where the snow melted and then froze and more snow was added, then melted and so on, all during the same year. There can be many hot and cold periods in a single year of snow, especially on Greenland. This was illustrated handily by a group of historical buffs who were intent on retrieving a P-38 airplane that was abandoned during World War II on Greenland in 1942. They knew its exact location, so they melted their way through 250 feet of ice down to the plane. Then took the plane apart and brought it up through the melt hole. Though the plane had been in the ice for about 50 years at the time of its retrieval, they had melted their way through hundreds of these so-called annual layers. This instantly brings the age of the snow on Greenland to about 1/10 of the previous ages attributed to the snow on Greenland. And obviously the principle works for Antarctica as well. But even that date has been debated. With the top layers accumulating around 5 feet a year and the bottom layers compressed to about 8 inches, means that the average annual depth of ice on Greenland, the age of the ice, is only about 6,000 years. That's what I thought. However, this assumption of a snowfall of 5 feet per year going back to the bottom layer is based on current weather patterns. However, during the Maunder minimum and the Dalton minimum, and probably many years during the times when these volcanic actions were occurring, the snowfall was more prevalent and would have been far, far greater per year. In the northeast of the map is a community drawn called S. Thomas, or St. Thomas. This name really throws a monkey wrench into the data and the dating on the map. Alternate archaeologists who do accept these maps' existence assume these maps were drawn in ancient times when alternative historians know a time when highly advanced technology civilization existed. We assume these maps survived and were recopied down through the ages and then resurfaced in 1380 and were copied then. It seemed to me that only in ancient times after the flood could Greenland have been free of ice. But if this little known town or place on the map is named after the biblical Doubting Thomas, it would suggest these maps were drawn after the time of Christ. No group of historians I know of would even remotely suggest this advanced capability existed during this time frame. If this is the case, then even more staggering is the fact that it is free of ice at this time. However, the map is dated just after the medieval warm period ended. The very area when it could have been free of ice is exactly when the maps were apparently drawn and copied. The Viking called it Greenland, And we just assumed, like we were told in school, that they were playing tricks on us, with the name to scare people away from the more fertile Iceland. But don't forget, they settled there during the medieval warm period. Suddenly this map makes sense. One of the reasons cartographers and geologists discount these maps as impossible is because of several islands seen on it that do not exist in these places today. However, this too can be nipped in the bud. As stated, one of the reasons these maps were discounted out of hand is because the maps showed islands that just aren't there today. Some have suggested they were put there to fill space, which is the most ridiculous theory you can imagine. Columbus had maps with islands on them that he tried to find to provision his boats from, and almost starved himself and his crew looking for them. The last thing any cartographer wants on a map is fictional islands, because that'll kill you if you're an explorer and you're looking for them. No cartographer in their right mind would make maps with islands that don't exist. So if they were drawn on there, they had to have been there at some point in time. And it appears at least one of these islands is known to have existed exactly as it was mapped during recent historical times. It's very much worth noting that from the 1550s to the 1660s, people from Greenland and Europe traded with the people of the well-populated island of Friesland. Though many of my sources say this is true, I've not been able to independently find any historical records of trade with this island, but it's stated as true. Then in the 17th century, Friesland just disappeared from maps and apparently from the face of the waters. Indeed, all of the islands west of East Estland, or Faroes and Zetland as they're now, and at least 4 islands shown on the eastern Great Britain all just disappeared from maps. Another reason these maps are discounted is because they lend some credibility to the prior existence of Atlantis, which of course is verboten. And indeed many internet sects call Atlantis the myth and believe it is likened to believing in the Easter Bunny. The evolution theory tends to pigeonhole how history is written, with assumptions that rule out anyone before our current technological age having any kind of advanced technology on a par with our own at their disposal, because supposedly we are evolving. But if we allow that for a brief time during the 500 medieval warm period, technology flourished where manned flight existed, as Roger Bacon stated, and technical skill to draw Greenland and Antarctica correctly, it suggests that this island was free of ice just 700 years ago, probably as a result of the 500-year-long medieval warm period, and subsequently has gotten pounded with snow and ice ever since, which built up extremely fast during the Maunder and Dalton minimums. This would handily explain how the oceans of the Earth could lose 20 feet of water in just 400 years. Furthermore, since we know that there is excessive volcanic action during this period, it stands to reason this is the explanation as to why these islands no longer are where they were drawn in the Atlantic on these maps, because they are on the Atlantic Ridge and they are situated on the most active fault on the globe. With this eye-popping realization that all of Greenland could have been completely free of ice in recent history, and then covered with so much ice and snow during the swings in climate over the centuries, which we think took 110,000 years to accumulate, means our attempt to alter climate in any way, shape, or form is utterly futile. And it would be like trying to kill a woolly mammoth with a pea shooter. Governments of the world are wasting their time trying to kill this woolly mammoth, and they're wasting your money in this futile attempt. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video and me mumble and stumble through all these words. Though this video focuses mainly on clarifying some of the climate change misinformation, it does touch on some of the ancient mysteries I solved in my 2 books. Both are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other book sites. And you can see more material about these on my website, floodlegends.com. If you'd like a transcript of this video material, you can find me on email or morseverbal@hotmail.com, or email through my Facebook. My main purpose here wasn't to sell my books, just to try and clarify what is going on with this climate change and try and stop governments from wasting our money and us because we need to increase our food production. So, you know, anyway, that should be it. Thanks for listening. I hope this works.